Hello, YouTube. What's good? How you doing today? Hope the movements are going strong in your area. Waiting for live video. They said. Use camera. There it is. Bam. What's good, Facebook? How are you doing today? Hope the movement's going strong in your area. Yo, what's good? TikTok, first time going to do a TikTok live here. And so basically, yeah, I'm going to be reading chapters from Our Enemies in Blue. Our Enemies in Blue is a book written by Kristian Williams back in 2004. It has some of the best analysis around from an anarchist, anti-capitalist perspective, as far as books that are out there that attempt to do that. And I suggest this book for everybody. And so, as part of the work I do for movement building against the capitalism, I do audiobooks. An audiobook that I have done, which is gaining a lot of traction recently, is the book "Are Prisons Obsolete" by Angela Davis. Folks should check that out on my YouTube. If you haven't already checked that out, I have all 6 chapters of that available in audio format on there. So basically, I'm going to be reading the preface first, and then we're going to do the introduction tonight here of this book. And so, how this works is I'm going to be recording on GarageBand an audio file of this chapter. This book is not available as an audiobook very easily, anyways. And so I'm attempting to make this book available as an audiobook. It's extremely relevant right now as far as the anti-police brutality movement and the sort of police abolition movement and defunding the police movement that's been happening across the country and across the world. And so I wish to, make this analysis available for a broader audience in order to strengthen the movement and for the folks to be educated and have the analysis around why we should abolish the police. And so, yeah, that's why I'm doing this. So this is the preface, right? So basically how this works is I'm going to be recording this and I will be doing some editing. If I make a mistake, I'll stop and then I'll rewind my GarageBand so that I don't have to edit it afterwards. I found that that's the quickest way to make these audiobooks and do the editing. We'll see, how it works. And so this is, without further ado, this is Our Enemies in Blue, Police and Power in America by Kristian Williams. Preface, 2014. In the summer of 2014, as I was working on the revisions for this new edition, rioting erupted in a Midwestern suburb. The incident that sparked the unrest was in most respects sadly typical. A white cop confronted a black teenager over a trivial violation of the law, literally, an everyday occurrence. And, as has happened many times before, at the end of the encounter, the young man was dead. Michael Brown had been walking in the street with a friend when police confronted them. Police say that Brown attacked Officer Darren Wilson and tried to take his gun, but witnesses insist that he had his hands in the air when he was fatally shot. Police also note that Brown had stolen some cigars from a convenience store a few minutes earlier, though Officer Wilson did not know that at the time. What is indisputable is that Wilson shot and killed Brown and that Brown was not armed. This story was painful and familiar. In fact, the only reason we know these details, the reason it is a story and not simply a statistic, is because of what happened next. The people of Ferguson, Missouri fought back. Suburban warfare. Officer Darren Wilson shot and killed Michael Brown on August 9, 2014. The next night, August 10th, marked the beginning of a cycle of antagonism and escalation, with police in riot gear and crowds looting stores. By August 11th, cops were firing rubber bullets and tear gas. Soon the crowds were battling them with rocks, bricks, bottles, firebombs, and occasional gunfire. The effect, as USA Today described it, was a city turned war zone. The police response surely helped to inflame the situation. One resident told a reporter, "When I see a cop in riot gear, first thing I think is riot. When I see someone that looks like they're ready to fight me, I'm going to put up my fists." The cops wore camouflage fatigues and body armor. Some carried assault rifles, even aiming them at protesters. They blocked off streets with armored cars, set up snipers' nests, and filled middle class neighborhoods with tear gas. In an effort to de escalate, the Missouri State Highway Patrol took over crowd control. Captain Ron Johnson, a black man from the area, expressed sympathy with the demonstrators and promised not to use tear gas. But faced with ongoing rioting, his officers did so regardless. Soon the governor imposed a curfew and deployed the National Guard. Amnesty International sent observers and called for an investigation into the police action. Navi Pillay, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, issued a statement condemning the excessive use of force by police, calling for the right of protest to be respected, and accusing the United States of practicing apartheid. Clearly worried, the White House began calling civil rights leaders around the country, 1,050 of them, to enlist these participants to help keep the situation calm and focused. Mediators from the Justice Department's Community Relations Service facilitated town hall meetings, inviting in Ferguson residents, police, and city officials, but excluding the media. Some members of the clergy took to the streets to urge peace, a few even calling for an end to protests altogether. Meanwhile, the right-leaning militia-style Oath Keepers started sending armed volunteers to guard area businesses, and the traditional American Knights of the Ku Klux Klan issued a warning to the terrorists masquerading as peaceful protesters, threatening them with lethal force. A separate Klan group, the New Empire Knights, claimed to be guarding homes and businesses of whites that feel threatened, and held a fundraiser for Officer Wilson. All money will go to the cop who did his job against the Negro criminal. Rioting would continue on and off for months, igniting with renewed vigor in late November when a grand jury announced its decision not to indict Officer Wilson. Lewis Head, Michael Brown's stepfather, screamed in rage outside a Ferguson police station. "Burn this bitch down!" That evening, police reported at least 21 buildings set on fire, 150 gunshots, damage to 10 police cars, and 60 arrests, twice in 2 weeks. On November 24th, the Ferguson grand jury announced its decision, no indictment. A few days later, on December 3rd, in New York City, another grand jury reached the same unsatisfying conclusion in a separate case of police violence, declining to indict Officer Daniel Pantaleo for the killing of Eric Garner. Earlier in the year, on July 17, 2014, New York City police confronted Garner, another unarmed black man, allegedly for selling single untaxed cigarettes called Lucy's. Video shows 4 officers pulling Garner to the ground, one with an arm around his neck. Garner gasps repeatedly, "I can't breathe." He died on the way to the hospital. In the span of 2 weeks, U.S. Representative Marcia Fudge chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, observed, "This nation seems to have This nation seems to have heard one message loud and clear: there will be no accountability for taking black lives." Phrased this way, she invited a comparison, deliberately or not, between the recent grand jury decisions and the 19th century legal principle solidified in the Supreme Court's Dred Scott ruling that African Americans represent a subordinate and inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race and, whether emancipated or not, yet remained subject to their authority, and had no rights or privileges but such as those who held the power and the government might choose to grant them. Or more simply, they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. For Dred Scott, the issue was slavery. For Brown and Garner, it was murder. Connecting the cases was the failure, or rather the refusal, of the judicial system to extend its protection to the African American population. That sense of existing without rights, of living under threat, of being discounted, was sadly, insistently conveyed in the slogan that arose in connection to the protests: Black Lives Matter. It is shameful, I feel, that we even have to make this point, that it is necessary to say, even once, that Black Lives Matter is itself a testimony to the racism of our society. It ought to be obvious that Black Lives Matter, that Black people matter, and by implication that their murder, especially at the hands of the state, cannot go unanswered. And yet it is not obvious. In the context of the legal system, the recent evidence suggests that it is not even true. The slogan represents, then, not simply a fact, but more importantly, a challenge. If we believe it, we must make it real. When the Ferguson grand jury announced its decision, protesters mobilized in more than 170 cities across the country, blocking streets and even freeways, enacting die-ins at police stations, briefly occupying the mayor's office in Chicago. Most were peaceful. Only Oakland matched Ferguson in terms of intensity, breaking windows, looting businesses, blockading a police station, building and burning barricades. The protests grew when the New York grand jury likewise declined to indict Officer Pantaleo. Approximately 10,000 people joined protests in New York City, chanting, "Shut the whole system down," while blocking the Manhattan and Brooklyn bridges and sometimes skirmishing with police. In the first 2 days, 302 people were arrested, 3 for felonies. Displays of solidarity started appearing in some unexpected places across the country. Individual athletes and sometimes entire teams, professional and college, men's and women's, began wearing "I Can't Breathe" t-shirts during their pregame exercises. And in the rush of one of the busiest weeks on the congressional calendar, dozens of Capitol Hill staffers walked out of their offices, gathered on the Capitol steps, raised their hands in remembrance of Michael Brown, and prayed for forgiveness. Officers down. In the midst of the turmoil, on December 20th, a disturbed man named Ismail Brinsley approached 2 New York City police officers as they sat in their squad car. Brinsley shot both officers, Wenjon Liu and Rafael Ramos, firing at point-blank range and killing them instantly. He then killed himself. He had posted messages on the internet earlier that morning announcing a plan for putting announcing a plan for putting wings on pigs to avenge Eric Garner. They take one of ours, let's take two of theirs. Naturally, police and politicians, from New York Police Commissioner William Bratton and Mayor Bill de Blasio to U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder and President Barack Obama, were quick to condemn the shooting and express sympathy and support for the police, as did prominent civil rights leaders and Eric Garner's family. Patrick Lynch, the head of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, or PBA, however, put the blame on the cops' political enemies. There is blood on many hands, he said, from those that indicted violence under the guise of protests to the steps of City Hall and the office of the mayor. No, it's incited violence. Hold on. Okay. From those who incited violence under the guise of protests to the steps of City Hall and the office of the mayor. He later repeated, the mayor's hands are literally dripping with our blood because of his words, actions, and policies. The PBA went on to declare war, though with the perpetrator dead, it is unclear against whom. We have, for the first time in a number of years, become a wartime police department. We will act accordingly. The PBA also offered its own instructions to patrol officers. At least 2 units are to respond to every call, no matter the condition or severity, no matter what type of job is pending, or what the opinion of the patrol supervisor happens to be. Meanwhile, patrol officers began an unofficial and likely illegal slowdown. In the days following the ambush of Lou and Ramos, police made 66% fewer arrests and wrote 94% fewer tickets. The rift between the cops and the mayor seems particularly deep. Lynch has complained repeatedly of a lack of support after Garner's death, in part because Mayor de Blasio spoke publicly about a conversation in which he advised his biracial son to take special care when interacting with the police. In retort, the PBA began offering a form for officers, instructing the mayor not to attend their funerals if they die in the line of duty. Then, when de Blasio spoke at Lou and Ramos's funerals, hundreds of police turned their back to him. A legitimacy problem. The death of Eric Garner and that of Michael Brown, the grand jury decisions, and even the riots all fit an established pattern, one we've seen repeatedly in just the past few years, beginning in Oakland in 2009, then Portland and Denver in 2010, Seattle and San Francisco in 2011, Atlanta and Anaheim in 2012, Santa Rosa, Flatbush, and Durham in 2013, and Salinas and Albuquerque earlier in 2014. But the scale of the crisis sparked by Brown's shooting and its duration make it truly exceptional, and both political and cultural elites seem to have understood it as such. Police unions and some commanders, as well as the reliable right-wing pundits, have obstinately defended their positions and cynically used the deaths of 2 hapless patrolmen to go back on the offensive. Other authorities, however, have been more careful and conciliatory, offering modest reforms and adjusting their rhetoric to match the nation's overall mood. As journalist Matt Taibbi so succinctly put it, the police suddenly have a legitimacy problem. President Barack Obama did his best to equivocate while calling for peace and calm. There is never an excuse for violence against police or for those who would use this tragedy as a cover for vandalism or looting. There's also no excuse for police to use excessive force against peaceful protests or to throw protesters in jail for lawfully exercising their First Amendment rights. Attorney General Eric Holder added, at a time when we must seek to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the local community, I am deeply concerned that the deployment of military equipment in vehicles sends a conflicting message. Soon thereafter, the president ordered a review of the police use of military weaponry. It's too early to know whether any lasting structural changes will result from the current unrest, but if nothing else, it has certainly changed the terms of debate. Time magazine, for example, ran a surprising piece titled "In Defense of Rioting." It cogently argues riots are a necessary part of the evolution of society. Until human rights are respected, the legitimate frustration, sorrow, and pain of the marginalized voices will boil over, spilling out into our streets. Blacks in this country are more apt to riot because they are one of the populations here who still need to. Rolling Stone likewise published a short piece looking at historical and, in retrospect, entirely justifiable uses of property destruction, pointing to precedents like the Boston Tea Party, slave rebellions, the suffragists, the anti nuclear movement, and ongoing resistance to fracking. The magazine then went a step further, arguing that it's time to start imagining a society that isn't dominated by police and offering suggestions to help build a cop-free world. Even some conservatives, among them Senator Rob Portman, Senator Ted Cruz, Representative Paul Ryan, and the writer Eric Erickson, expressed concern about the crackdown on protests. There is a systemic problem with today's law enforcement, Senator Ron Paul wrote in an op-ed, pointing to militarization, paired with an erosion of civil liberties and due process, represented by national security letters, no-knock searches, broad general warrants, and pre-conviction forfeiture. Then, unexpectedly, he departed from the Tea Party script. Given the racial disparities in our criminal justice system, it is impossible for African Americans not to feel like their government is targeting them. Anyone who thinks that race does not still, even if inadvertently, skew the application of criminal justice in this country is just not paying close enough attention. It may be that the video of police literally strangling an African American man, is it too much to compare it to lynching? Disturbed the consciousness of the nation, even those on the political right. And it may be that the sight of armored vehicles on suburban streets proved disconcerting to the small government crowd. But the cops kill black people with some regularity, and the militarization of local police has been underway for decades, often with the support of some of the same figures now expressing their somber concerns. The simple fact is that authorities are responding not to the deaths or to the military grade weaponry as such, but to the riots. Rioting made policing a problem for elites. On its own, the death of a black man is what economists call an externality, somebody else's trouble. Racial profiling and zero tolerance policing, the treatment of whole communities as suspicious in themselves, and the idea that cops might stop, arrest, or even kill you simply for jaywalking are just business as usual until they provoke a crisis. Neither President Obama nor Attorney General Eric Holder had any qualms about giving the police military hardware. It was only when the armored vehicles and assault rifles started showing up on the television news that they started to worry. It was the riots that put these issues on the national agenda. No number of petitions, lawsuits, op-ed columns, or books on the subject could have had the same effect. The riots of the previous few months pulled into focus some of the most troubling aspects of policing, and with them, some of the deepest injustices in our society. The unrest was not just about Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Officer Wilson, Officer Pantaleo, gunshots, and chokeholds. It was also about racial profiling and the standards of public order. But beyond that, too, it was about race, class, and violence, ultimately about questions of freedom and equality. Revisions. Our Enemies in Blue first appeared in 2004, 10 years before the events described above, yet so many of the themes central to the book have suddenly found themselves in the headlines: race, class, violence, standards of public order, rioting, crowd control, the militarization of local departments, the power of police unions, collaboration with racist paramilitaries, the co-optation of social movement leaders, the promise and perils of reform, and alternatives to policing. History suddenly seems very present. I have in this preface only begun the story of Ferguson and the nationwide wave of resistance that followed Michael Brown's murder. We do not yet know how that story ends, but I hope that it comes to represent not merely a new chapter in the history of policing, but a decisive break from the past. It is with the future as well as the past that this book is concerned. I began my research on policing nearly 20 years ago now, not as an academic exercise, but because in my political organizing I was confronted with pressing questions that I did not then know how to answer. I turned to the past to help us understand the present, so that we might change the future. Returning to the book 10 years later, my aims are largely the same. This new edition brings the history up to date and revises some of the earlier material, while keeping the same general structure, argument, and narrative as the original. As one might expect, the bulk of the revisions come toward the end of the volume. In addition to updating statistics, adding more recent examples, and correcting some mistakes or oversights, I have also substantively adjusted my analysis when new developments, or just new ideas, require it. For instance, the implications of the USA Patriot Act, shifts in crowd control strategies, and even the domestic effects of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are all far clearer now than they were 10 years ago. Fortunately, the decade's changes are not all in the same direction. As policing intensifies, resistance also seems to be growing, not only in the recent riots, but in the immigrants' rights movement, in the short lived but long reverberating Occupy encampments, and in a marked increase in experiments with community alternatives to the criminal legal justice system. I have tried to incorporate all of those developments into this new edition. There is much still that I could have added. Historical accounts are by their very nature incomplete. There are other stories that could be told, other histories still to be uncovered, and with each new day more that could be said. So I begin here not at the end, but in the midst of a crisis. We can see in these moments of rebellion, and this is true however they turn out, not only anger and grief, but also an almost instinctual feeling for the demands of justice, an urgent recognition of the humanity of the oppressed, and a sense of possibility, however vague or distant, for a different kind of life, a new society. The fires of rebellion burn with rage, but they shine with the light of hope. Kristian Williams, Portland, Oregon, December 31st, 2014. Bam. Okay, so I'm ending my audio recording. Yeah, I think that's really relevant, obviously, and I liked when Kristian Williams was talking about how, strangling black folks and black men in the case of Eric Garner, and now in the case of George Floyd, how akin that is to actual lynching when they used to hang folks, thousands of people. And I think that's a very poignant uh, comparison, right? All right, y'all. Well, this was my first TikTok live. Hope y'all enjoyed it. Freaking appreciate y'all tuning in. And so, yeah, I'm going to sign off, and we will see y'all on the flip side here. Peace out, TikTok. Bam. And so, YouTube and Facebook, I'm going to still go keep y'all live. I'm going to go instead of, I'm going to switch over doing some live because y'all are on my desktop, and let's see, on my phone, reading Our Enemies in Blue. I'm gonna go live now for the introduction, and then that's all I'll be doing tonight. I'll go live for my introduction on Twitter now. And by the way, I'm Little Guillotine. And you can peep me on all the social media sites. I'm LITL Guillotine on Instagram. And what else am I at on? Instagram and Twitter, I think. Yep, that's right. That's right. Oh, you can invite guests now on Twitter live? I didn't know that. What's up, Twitter? How y'all doing? Hope the resistance is strong in your area. Definitely need to see some more resistance. Uprising is a beautiful thing. So yeah, for Twitter folks who don't know, I am reading Our Enemies in Blue, which is a pivotal analysis around police and in our society in the United States. It's classic work done by Kristian Williams in 2004 and then updated again in 2014. And of course, is very relevant now. And so, yeah, I'm doing an audiobook. It'll be available on my YouTube. You also check on my YouTube if you don't already. Subscribe, Lil Guillotine. I don't know if y'all heard, there was an article on Crime Think, which I respect a lot, like Crime Think. That was talking about how we shouldn't use the guillotine as a symbol because it's very authoritarian, which I think is cogent. But I'm going to be doing a video about that, my thoughts on that, because I don't 100% agree with that analysis. Although they do make some really good points in that article. And there's also a YouTube video where it's on From Embers, which is a great podcast, and they interview the author from Crime Think. So yeah, you can check this out on my YouTube too. All right, so we're gonna get this the introduction. This is a good introduction, y'all. We're gonna get this popping. All right, so Our Enemies in Blue: Police and Power in America by Kristian Williams. Introduction by Andrea J. Ritchie. Broken Windows, Broken System. As the original edition of Our Enemies in Blue would predict, not much has changed in terms of how policing functions in the United States since it was first published. This reality, in and of itself, underscores the unique contribution and critical importance of this book and of its timely update. Our Enemies in Blue offers a systematic, well-researched, readable, and engaging examination of the evolution of police forces as tools of political control, as well as political entities of their own, tracing the roots of policing from imposition of colonial order in England, Ireland, and the Americas to slave patrols and urban watches allows us to see the skeleton underlying the present shape of policing, illuminates the social forces that drive policing paradigms, and charts the complicity of community members from the Klan through George Zimmerman in the project of controlling Black, immigrant, and working class people. There are new names: Oscar Grant, Ramarley Graham, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Akai Gurley, and with each of them new moments of resistance. Yet the history of modern-day policing, outlined in careful and compelling detail in the first edition of Our Enemies in Blue, now updated and applied to the events of the past 10 years, continues to play out, not only in single incidents of deadly force against Black and brown bodies, but also in the everyday violence of policing, be it racially discriminatory stop and frisk practices in New York City, continuing racial disparities in traffic stops on the nation's streets and freeways, or through daily stops, searches, beatings, sexual assaults, and police occupation of communities of people of color that are not just reminiscent of slavery in the Jim Crow era, but its direct descendants, exposing the core of policing, as well as the social forces that drive it, enables us to see that even as its outward form shifts over time, the underlying structure and purpose ultimately remains the same, decade after decade. This is not to say that resistance has had no impact. It has forced police departments to shift strategies and has at times reduced some harms of policing. It is simply to say that the history of policing, the underlying forces of punishment, and responses to calls for reform laid out in the following pages is essential to understanding how we arrived at the present moment and to envisioning what lies ahead. By placing the string of individual cases of police violence that have captured headlines over the past 2 decades into a larger context, we are pushed beyond an understanding of them as individual acts of racist police officers to an examination of their root causes and sinister systemic underpinnings. Our demands for change are thus necessarily expanded beyond prosecutions in individual cases and advocacy for police reform, while simultaneously acknowledging the pain and outrage generated by each individual act of police violence and the limited respite changes to policing policies can bring, particularly relevant to the present moment and the broken windows policing practices that ultimately killed Mike Brown and Eric Garner. Our Enemies in Blue chronicles the emergence of order maintenance policing as the modern day manifestation of black codes, vagrancy laws, and common nightwalker ordinances. Pursuant to this theory, through what has become known as quality of life policing, officers are given explicit permission and discretion to target populations inextricably intertwined with notions of the dangerous classes, described in Our Enemies in Blue. Police extortion schemes of old are replaced with a more elaborate shakedown of poor people through assessment of exorbitant fees and fines for minor, vague, and discriminatorily enforced quality of life offenses such as littering, sleeping, eating, or appearing disorderly or lewd in public. Indeed, it is telling that the biggest impact of the slowdown by NYPD officers in early 2015 was loss of revenue, not increased crime, and that first olive branch offered by the Ferguson Police Department in the wake of the uprising following Mike Brown's murder by Darren Wilson was a reduction in fees associated with failing to appear in court answer to minor charges which were the bread and butter of city coffers. Perhaps the most critical intervention Our Enemies in Blue makes to the current moment comes in the final chapter, which traces the roots of militarization of police departments displayed in such stark and brutal relief during the days and months following Mike Brown's killing in Ferguson, to the advent of SWAT teams and the declaration of a war on drugs. Here Williams reveals community policing, the kinder, friendlier face of law enforcement, being advanced as its alternative to simply be another side of the same coin. Like early police forces, community policing works to conscript civilians and helping institutions into the project of social control, while serving as the stick that continues to enforce the order that serves existing power relations. One thing that has changed since the first edition is the way we understand how policing operates along the axis of gender and sexuality. Within the alongside those, I made a mistake, and so I'm going to live. Okay, here we go. Within and alongside those of race and class, over the past decade, a body of work has emerged which, like Conquest, Sexual Violence, and American Indian Genocide by Andrea Smith, traces its lineage back to indigenous women's resistance to the sexualized violence by state actors that has been an essential weapon of colonization. Or like Law Enforcement Violence Against Women of Color, an article I authored for Color of Violence, the Insight Anthology, South End Press 2006, to Black women's resistance to slave patrols and lynching, and to the struggles of freedom fighters like Fannie Lou Hamer, Angela Davis, and Assata Shakur in response to police violence against themselves and their communities. Some of this work, like the book I co-authored with Joey Mogul and Kay Whitlock, Queer Injustice, The Criminalization of LGBT People in the United States, draws directly on the history of morals enforcement through vagrancy laws and on the critical analysis of broken windows policing offered by our enemies in blue to highlight how policing operates to enforce racialized and classed norms of gender and sexuality in both public and private spheres. This process is mediated, as we discuss in Queer Injustice, through criminalizing narratives and archetypes that literally shape how the same conduct by different people is perceived differently within the context of maintaining order and ensuring community safety. Others, like Dean Spade's Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law, and Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment, and the Prison Industrial Complex, edited by Nat Smith and Eric Stanley, further elucidate the multiple ways in which law enforcement, prisons, and other systems of control explicitly police the lines of the gender binary. This literature, along with research conducted by grassroots organizations, policy advocacy groups, academics, and even law enforcement, as well as powerful interventions made by Black feminists in the post-Ferguson public discourse, has irrevocably expanded the frame of the conversation around policing to incorporate the voices and experiences of women of color and LGBTQ people of color targeted by gendered and sexuality-based forms of racial profiling and police violence, painting a more complete picture of the structures and dynamics of policing. For instance, researchers have begun to dig deeper into the statistics illuminating patterns of racialized policing detailed in Chapter 4 to unearth the experiences of women of color. As noted in a submission endorsed by over 75 organizations and individuals to the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which was convened as a result of sustained national outcry in the wake of failure to hold officers who killed Mike Brown and Eric Garner accountable. Although racial profiling data reported by federal and state governments is rarely, if ever, disaggregated by race and sex, racial profiling studies which do analyze the experiences of women of color separately from those of men of color conclude that for both men and women, there is an identical pattern of stops by race and ethnicity. For instance, in New York City, one of the jurisdictions with the most extensive data collection on police stops, rates of racial disparities in stops and arrests are identical among men and women. Racial profiling of women of color has specifically been reported in the context of law enforcement practices associated with the war on drugs and the policing of prostitution-related offenses. Black women and women of color who have played a leadership role in struggles against state-sponsored violence since colonial times and slavery, have increasingly insisted on recognition that we too are direct and not collateral or occasional targets of police shootings and violence, as pointed out to the task force. Black women and women of color also experience excessive force up to and including police shootings, including most recently Jessie Hernandez, a 16-year-old queer Latina killed by Denver police as this submission was being prepared. Ara Rosser, a 40-year-old black woman killed by Ann Arbor police, and Tanisha Anderson, a 37-year-old black woman killed by Cleveland police, all of whom were killed in the short period of time since this task force was established. In the weeks following Eric Garner's killing in New York City, an NYPD officer put Roseanne Miller, a black 27-year-old 5-month pregnant woman, in a chokehold as they attempted to arrest her for grilling on the sidewalk. Denise Stewart, a black grandmother who also had asthma, was dragged naked into a hallway by officers who falsely assumed she was abusing her children. A woman perceived by NYPD officers to be queer was thrown to the ground and beaten after being accused of jaywalking in the West Village. And another pregnant mother was thrown to the ground in Sunset Park by NYPD officers who then used a taser to her stomach. These are but a few examples of the excessive force to which women of color are submitted on a routine basis, and which also must be at the center of national debates surrounding police shootings and use of excessive force against people of color. As our enemy in blue points out early on, what is defined as police brutality is normatively constructed. The common construction excludes not only women and LGBT people of color's experiences of what is normatively defined as police brutality, physical violence up to including murder of black and brown men, but also gender and sexuality-specific forms of racialized and poverty-based police violence. For instance, since the time of colonial armies to the present day, sexual violence has been unacknowledged but essential weapon of institutionalized policing, so clearly described in these pages. The submission to the task force goes on to note, in 2010, the Cato Institute's National Police Misconduct Statistics and Reporting Project found sexual assault and misconduct was the second most frequently reported form of police misconduct after excessive force, representing 9.3% of complaints analyzed. Over half of the officers involved in reported misconduct were alleged to have engaged in forcible, non-consensual sexual conduct while on duty. Over half of incidents analyzed alleged police sexual misconduct with minors. Rates of sexual assault rising to the level of FBI index crimes were found to be significantly higher among law enforcement officers than the general population. Other studies found that up to 2 in 5 young women reported sexual harassment by law enforcement, and that young women of color, low-income women, lesbian and transgender women, and otherwise marginalized women, as well as men and transgender people, are particularly vulnerable to sexual misconduct by law enforcement. Sexual harassment and assault have been reported to be particularly pervasive during traffic stops and in the context of police cadet programs intended to engage youth from the community. It is also reported to take place with alarming frequency in the context of responses to requests for assistance or investigation of domestic violence or sexual assault. Sexual harassment and assault by law enforcement officers may take many forms, ranging from sexual comments to unwarranted callbacks to crime victims, to extorting sexual favors in exchange for leniency, to unlawful strip searches, including searches to assign gender, to forcible or coercive sexual conduct, including rape. It is by no means an isolated phenomenon, and while not an officially sanctioned law enforcement activity, is facilitated by the authority vested in law enforcement officers. Similarly, separate testimony submitted to the task force on behalf of over 45 LGBT organizations pointed out that, as noted by the NAACP's recently released report, Born Suspect, LGBTQ people of color experience gender and sexuality specific forms of racial profiling and police brutality. Additionally, LGBTQ people, particularly LGBTQ youth and people of color, also experience pervasive profiling and discriminatory treatment by local, state, and federal law enforcement agents based on actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, or expression, or HIV status. Over the past decade, the National Coalition on Anti-Violence Programs, or NCAVP, has found that law enforcement agents have consistently been among the top 3 categories of perpetrators of homophobic or transphobic violence against LGBTQ people reported to anti-violence organizations. In a recent national survey of LGBTQ people conducted by Lambda Legal, a quarter of respondents who had in-person contact with police reported at least one type of misconduct or harassment, including profiling, false arrests, verbal or physical assault, or sexual harassment or assault. LGBTQ people of color, LGBTQ youth, low-income LGBTQ people, and transgender people were much more likely to report an experience of at least one type of police misconduct or harassment. Across the country, non-heterosexual youth are more likely to be stopped by the police and experience greater criminal justice sanctions not explained by greater involvement in violating the law. Investigations of local police departments in New Orleans and Puerto Rico by the U.S. Department of Justice have documented patterns and practices of profiling and discriminatory policing of LGBTQ people, and a number of local organizations have documented department-specific patterns and practices. These more recent studies echo the patterns of practices of police misconduct identified by Amnesty International in its 2005 report, Stonewalled: Police Misconduct and Abuse Against LGBT People in the United States. Widespread homophobic, transphobic, and sexual harassment, name-calling, and verbal abuse by law enforcement officers, profiling, and discriminatory enforcement, including citation of possession or presence of condoms as evidence of intent to engage in prostitution-related or lewd conduct offenses, failure to respect gender identity and expression when addressing members of the public and during arrest processing, searches and placement in police custody, unconstitutional and unlawful searches to assign gender, sexual assault and rape by law enforcement officers, and dangerous placement and cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment in police custody. By incorporating an analysis of the ways in which systemic police violence affects all members of our communities in both similar and unique ways, this literature has informed and driven the work described in the afterword to this edition, envisioning and, more importantly, enacting a world without police, while offering the clearest of rationales for doing so. Ultimately, police operate as a source of violence rather than safety, even for those the law claims to protect. for reasons deeply rooted in the history of policing that Our Enemies in Blue so clearly lays out for us. Our Enemies in Blue critically informs and provides an essential basis for analysis of present and future possibilities in the current moment, and offers examples and criteria by which to evaluate our efforts. What does prevention and response to violence look like? And given the history of police and policing through the present day, can the police ever be the ones to provide them? By Andrea J. Ritchie, Brooklyn, New York, March 2015. Andrea Ritchie is a black lesbian police misconduct attorney and organizer who has engaged in extensive research, writing, litigation, organizing, and advocacy on profiling, policing, and physical and sexual violence by law enforcement agents against women, girls, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender LGBT people of color over the past 2 decades. She was recently rewarded a Soros Justice Fellowship to engage in documentation and policy advocacy around the experiences of women of color, trans and not trans, queer and not queer, of profiling and policing. Ritchie helped found and coordinate Streetwise and Safe, or SAS, a leadership development initiative aimed at sharing Know Your Rights information, strategies for safety, and visions for change among LGBT youth of color who experience of gender, race, sexuality, and poverty-based policing and criminalization, and now serves as the organization's senior policy counsel. Ritchie is co-author of Queer Injustice: The Criminalization of LGBT People in the United States, Beacon Press 2011, and serves on the steering committee of Communities United for Police Reform. All right, that was the introduction to Our Enemies in Blue. Yeah, I thought it was particularly the law enforcement agents consistently been among the top 3 categories of perpetrators of homophobic or transphobic violence against LGBTQ people. Yeah, that's a shocking statistic that the police are, top 3 perpetrators of violence on LGBT people. Although I guess not surprising when you think about how shitty police are in general. But yeah, that was just a glimpse. I think, yeah, this would be great for movement building and getting some analysis around why we need to abolish police. But yeah, I'm gonna tap out. It's getting late, so this is Lil Guillotine reading "Our Enemies in Blue" by Kristian Williams, written in 2004 and then revised in 2014. But y'all look up my YouTube channel. I know this is ironic for people watching me on YouTube, but check out my YouTube for more analysis. Folks should check out my audiobook of Angela Davis's "Are Prisons Obsolete?" Another great pivotal work for the movement that folks should check out if you like audiobooks on my YouTube. It's called Lil Guillotine. All right, y'all. Peace out. Have a good morning. Peace.